welcome back to Snack
Hi.
Chats. Hello. Yes.
How's it
Here we
going, Gina?
are. Oh, it's good. It is good. I realize we're both wearing glasses and I can kind of see my reflection and your reflection. Anyways, I digress and distract. Okay, so today we're going to be chatting about eating disorder diagnosis and the role of us, the dietitians, and what do we do with this? So, topics that we'll be kind of chatting about is we will be kind of doing a brief info of our role in the diagnosis of eating disorders and then highlighting the prevalence of eating disorders and the specialized needs for nutrition intervention. We are not going to be reviewing the specific diagnostic criteria. Instead, we'll include some resources where you can review this. Because we can all read it and whatnot, and maybe that's something that Gina and I expand on in another thing, but for the sake of time. And you know what just popped up in my head, Gina? Like I remember the days back in treatment, having to like do the nutrition assessment with a client because I, as a dietitian in treatment, was doing that assessment and seeing what criteria they qualified met, whatever. And one of the resources, maybe we could link it, let's make a note, but is the Jessica Setnick's ED clinical pocket guide. I wish I had it. Like that would have
I
been
have
such a
it.
good thing.
It's
No,
behind me.
it's behind
Oh,
her. Oh my
it
God.
should be behind me. And if it's
It's
okay,
not.
no,
Okay, we'll
I
link
failed.
it.
It's
But
there though, somewhere.
that to me was such a helpful resource when I was first starting out because I didn't have all of this information memorized in my mind toolkit. So don't be overwhelmed if you don't memorize all of this stuff. Like you can use these tangible resources to go like, what criteria do they meet, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, just throwing
I
that in
used
there.
it in my assessments. I would have it out because I love the way the questions were asked. And I would think,
Yeah,
this is so great. I would like write notes about it. Okay. Yes,
yeah,
we
yeah,
both have fond memories.
yeah. So the thing I want to also include is that, we have kind of these, for lack of better words, standard eating disorders. So we have anorexia, bulimia, binge eating. Now we have ARFID, but there are also other eating disorders like pica, night eating syndrome. What else am I missing?
That are in the diagnostic standard or not in the
Yes.
diagnostic.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
then we go into diabulimia, orthorexia, right? Like such a good note by Gina. But so all of this information is really in that pocket guide, and we will include resources in it. So yeah. Any tidbits you want to add there, Gina?
No, you got that.
Oh, cool. So let's see. So some of the things we are as dietitians, I want to note, we cannot actually diagnose. Sad. So there are a lot of professionals that reach out directly to us, like, why don't you have the diagnosis? Or for insurance purposes, a lot of times we in billing need a diagnosis on file, and we have to actually reach out to medical professionals or the therapist on the team. So doctor, psychiatrist, maybe an endocrinologist, um, sometimes the OBGYN. I don't know, maybe you have a really awesome OB. But you can also use the therapist. They are allowed to diagnose. And so we need to be reaching out to those professionals to be getting that documentation, because if we're talking about billing purposes, we are not allowed to just like place this diagnosis. So while we are not legally allowed to assign a diagnosis, we as dietitians can aid in the assessment process and provide valuable information to these professionals for the client in actually maybe meeting criteria for a diagnosis.
Yeah, I think that's a spot where we, have a lot of say that we can kind of, bring in. So we might be asked even from clinicians, like, what is their intake, frequency of behaviors, do the behaviors actually meet the specific diagnostic criteria, which you can look up and don't have to have memorized. But an example would be, are they binging or purging at least once a week for 3 months to fit this very specific diagnostic criteria? Has there been weight loss or weight changes? What are the thoughts and attitudes and behaviors about food and body? And so those are things that we might be doing that assessment for and really making note of to be able to support that diagnosis. Even though we might not be the one providing it or not the one providing it, we can share this information with the other providers to support their diagnosis.
Right.
Mhm.
So typically, this gathering of information can happen in the initial session. So I know in one of our videos, we kind of talked about our like flow of sessions and how like maybe some people follow an assessment and some people are a little bit more ebb and flow. And so I do think that there's a lot of pressure to maybe like gather this information in 1 or 2 sessions in like a traditional assessment. And if you are working in treatment or in a more like clinical oriented type of, you know, center, then it might be actually regulated that like, yes, you need to complete this assessment. And in this assessment, it is really a detailed form of gathering nutrition information. So everything Gina said, you can also assess some medical items related to the eating disorder behaviors. So that may be like, you know, have you had any recent weight loss or weight loss in the past, or weight changes, right? How are you feeling? Are you feeling fatigued? Do you have low energy? If you have a period, how are those? Do you get dizzy when you stand up? Do you have any gut issues? These questions can kind of expand. And maybe that's a YouTube that Gina and I do of like what to include on that assessment sheet. But so that can really aid in that. Or you can be more so in an outpatient setting and have this like flow where I'm actually gathering this information over like a 3-month period because I'm working on building rapport. Maybe the client isn't super open to releasing this information. And so I do want to validate like the timing isn't always so rigid in kind of this outpatient work. We would like to be able to gather all this information so we can create more of a streamlined process, but it doesn't work like that. Our clients are not robots. They are actually living human beings, and we need to be able to respect their consent. So, yeah.
Well, and that kind of makes me think too about how so often, especially in an outpatient setting, a lot of the clients we're working with may not even meet this very specific criteria for
Yeah.
a diagnostic. And so really thinking about how disordered eating and eating disorders, though they may not fit this exact diagnostic or you can't diagnose, it doesn't mean that there isn't still a challenge there. Maybe what some people would term subclinical eating disorders, or there are like the other specified feeding and eating disorders where it's not quite meeting the criteria, but it's still distressing and impacting quality of life and medical health and mental health and every aspect of life. Or those diagnostics like we mentioned that aren't even in the criteria, right, or in the DSM. So orthorexia or things where we see someone's really struggling but they don't have a specific diagnosis. And really realizing that as you're doing this work, maybe the diagnosis isn't really even going to change how you're treating or caring for the client. So often, like, we are working someone for a period of time and we don't have a diagnosis for them, and that's okay because it's not going to change how you work with them. It's not like as soon as someone gets a diagnosis of anorexia, we all of a sudden change our approach. We're doing the same work regardless of if that diagnostic is there, right?
Right. Yeah.
So I think that's an important thing to hit on. And then I think one other thing I really just want to mention on diagnosis in general is that it is a bit more difficult or can be challenging for those who are, either men, identifying as men, or trans individuals to actually get diagnosis. There's been some progress in the diagnostic standards. So like amenorrhea or loss of cycle used to be a requirement for anorexia. It is not anymore. However, things like a hyper focus on thinness is, and maybe a man struggling is really focused on getting, bigger or more muscle or toned, and they don't really resonate with that language of thinness. And so they're being missed because they don't fit this very specific criteria, when in fact, they're still really, really struggling with relationships relationship with food. So on one hand, not being able to diagnose kind of allows us as dietitians to keep a broader perspective of, I see this person struggling, and so I know there's something here to work with. I don't have to put it in a box and label it to be able to support this individual.
Right. I do think that kind of expands on the accessibility of treatment for those individuals that maybe are getting misdiagnosed, and maybe their symptoms, because of maybe their culture or background or race, are just being minimized. And so I know specifically with female identifying Black individuals who are struggling with binge eating, a lot of times that is shunned upon or just minimized as, no, there's nothing going on there, or you can't really talk about it, or the provider isn't really creating accessible evaluations for those individuals, so they are stuck suffering and not getting the treatment that they deserve. So I do like, Gina, how you're hitting on that like us being able or not being able to diagnose really does kind of open up our mindset. But it is really important that because we're not diagnosing, it doesn't mean that you're still not asking these questions. And so making sure that we are creating an open mind and an open space for all individuals and not minimizing their reported struggles. And so most of the time in my practice, like, we're not really trying to identify that, like, well, you have an eating disorder. When it comes down to it, it's like, you're just struggling. Your quality of life is being impacted. And like Gina was saying, our treatment is going to still be the same, whether or not there's a diagnosis on file. But a lot of times we're kind of tied down because we do bill insurance. And so a lot of services are dictated but for like unlimited services, but you need a medical diagnosis of something like an eating disorder. And so we're kind of forced to evaluate and reach out and attach that diagnosis so that the client can have accessible care. So it kind of feels like we're in a catch-22 a little bit and kind of stuck. So
yeah. Unfortunate, but yes, it is what it
yeah.
is, where we are now with our
Yeah.
diagnostic abilities. So
Yeah.
cool. I think that kind of wraps it up. You got anything else?
The one thing I wanted to hit on is, like, again, the real value of being able to coordinate with a multidisciplinary team. This is just validating that, like, us as dietitians cannot do this alone, and that we need to be able to work with all individuals, therapists, psychologists, doctors, whatever it may be. And so even if we are trying to reach out, maybe they're not, like, really trying to express your need for coordination of care. So just kind of hitting that home because it is really so important.
There will be many a YouTube on collaborative care for sure.
Yeah. Awesome. Cool. Well, thanks for
Cool.
joining us today, and
Right.
check out our show notes for resources of where to get more detailed information. Have a good day.
Bye, y'all.